Hey guys, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about using automation on your gates. You know, in a previous video I talked pretty extensively about gates, about when you're going to gate versus chopping up tracks, about the different settings on a gate such as threshold. But today I want to talk about when you need to have different gate settings throughout your song and why using automation on your gate is a better approach than other methods. So before we get into any of the examples, I do want to talk about why automation is the right approach as opposed to some other approaches. These are things that I myself had tried before I, got into using automation. So I just want to kind of dispel some of that stuff first so we can kind of, agree on that we want to go full throttle with automation, and then we can dive into some of these examples. So I think the first sort of problem scenario that I would have run into before would have been if, let's say, the bridge of the song was very different from the rest. Maybe it opens up a lot, right? Or maybe it's like a second half of the song and everything is like super fast, something like that. I would, at the time, have, set up my gate at the beginning of the song, right? And then when I got to the latter part of the song, I would have been like, oh, I don't think the gate's good here. And I would have changed it up, right? And then maybe realized, if I was lucky, that it was no longer appropriate for the first half of the song. And then you get into this whole mess of trying to split the difference on the settings between the two different parts of the song. And the reality is that if you do that, if you're trying to find something that works well for both, you're really going to only end up with something that works terribly for both. So what might be kind of the novice next approach if you're like, I can't find a good one setting for these? You might decide that I'm going to take this track as the snare drum, as the bass drum. I'm going to make a second bass drum track, and I'm going to move some of the clips around, right? And now I'm going to have one set of plugins on this first track and another set of plugins on this other track. And most of the plugins are the same. So now what you're doing is you're greatly increasing how much work you have to do. Anytime you're like, I want to change the EQ, I want to change the compression. Now you have to make it in multiple places. All those plugins are still probably potentially processing nothing. So it's not free to have them up there. It just makes it a lot more clutter. For me, I happen to know the beginning of my project is always the drums, and I happen to know that, this, first track is going to be the snare, and then, this tom one is going to be on track 5, right? So if I start duplicating the tracks, now just finding my way through the project is going to be more complicated. So automation gives you a bit more precision, right? You're able to go in and make finer tune changes as you need them without duplicating tracks and plugins and everything else. But there is a little bit of a learning curve. But it's not that bad. So let's jump into this and kind of figure out our way through automation, and then you guys will be able to do this at home as well. So for this first example, this is something I've already have set up some automation on before on one of the tracks. We're going to do a similar setting on a different track. We're going to focus on the bass drum here. Now, on this song, the song is kind of metal. But the second half of it is a lot heavier. In fact, the double bass is a lot more intense. So I had to pick a point that I was going to change the automation on the gate, because I wanted basically to use the automation as a way of sculpting the bass drum so that I could have shorter sounding bass drum hits. So for our first example, I'm going to use this song. This is something where I've already done some automation on before. I have a track here that I haven't done any automation on, so we're going to throw it on this guy. So what am I doing here? Well, we have this song is metal. It's pretty heavy. The second half of the song, though, has the bass drum going really fast and at a constant beat. And I've had some issues with the mix before, where there's not enough of a volume drop off between the hits, and that's making things a little bit harder to hear in the mix. So let's first listen to the program material just to see what we have going on. So first we have just this first half of the song. Let's just listen to the bass drum here, and I've cranked this up in the mix a little bit. So that's the first half of the song. Now on the second half, you can see I have this section over here, and this is where things start to go a little awry for me. So it's not too bad, especially by itself, but you know, when you are popping this in the mix, it can get a little bit buried. So let's just take a listen to that. So it's a little harder to hear. Let's just let's mess around with some gate settings on this and just see what we might find that we think might be able to work well for us. So before you actually get into making the settings, because you don't want to just make this blind, right? You don't want to be like, oh, you know what, I think it needs to be, you know, less threshold, or I'm gonna, you know, shorten up the release in the whole time. You know, you don't want to just be kind of making those on the fly. You want to know what you're going to do going in, which means you're going to have to change the setting that you already have, which I just mentioned you don't want to do, right? You don't want to throw that away. So what you're going to do so that you can get it back is that you're just going to just open up any text editor, doesn't matter, right? And just write down, you know, the important settings that you have. All right, so, you know, for me, I'm going to care about the threshold and the hold time and the release time, right? And I happen to have it set up on both bass drum tracks are set up the same way, right? All right, perfect. Let's just focus on just one of these bass drum tracks just for a second. And we're going to crank this thing up. And we're going to start messing around with this. I'll put this in a loop. We're just going to start messing around with these settings until we find something we like a little bit better for this section. Okay, so at first I tried, I went crazy on this release here. First I tried to really shorten up, change the threshold quite a bit. That didn't seem to be working for me, but then I really tightened up the release and I tried to back down on the threshold, and that seemed to work out a little bit better. Probably can open up the release a little bit from here. Yeah, I was just trying to mess around with the hold, but I think I like the hold a little bit longer. You know, you don't want to go too short. Your hold plus your initial release, you probably don't want to be going less than 30 milliseconds there. Just because then it's too short, like the individual hits just become too short for you to be able to hear properly. So this seems to be working pretty good. But like I said, now what happened? Well, I've changed these settings. So now back over here, I have that same setting on the other part. So this is where automation is going to come into play, right? So now, all right, so I have my first half settings here. Let me just write down what the new settings are going to be for the second half. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the plugin back to how it was originally, right? So I have these other settings here. 39 and 293 for the release time. Perfect. So now we're going to get into the magic. So there's three things we're going to automate as part of this kind of pass through. We're going to automate the threshold, we're going to do the hold, and we're going to do the release. And I'm going to do this in 3 passes, like I said. Now, I actually have a big break here. There's a big pause between the first half and the second half, and that there's no bass drum going on. Actually, there's no drums going on at all during this section. But I think you'll find that when you're mixing, you'll have a lot less time. You won't usually have a big break like this. So I would recommend this. If you have multiple settings you need to change, automate them one at a time. So how are we going to actually do the automation here? So usually your plugin, or I should say your DAW, through your plugin, has read and write automation. And usually your write automation is already enabled by default, and you have to enable your write automation. Now, what's going to happen is that when write automation is enabled, if you make a change, it'll show up in the UI that something has happened there, and you kind of make through however many passes you need, trying to set each thing that you need. And when you're done, you shut off write automation again. We're going to turn on write automation. We're going to hit play. And when we get to the point that I want, I'm going to change the threshold to be this other value. All right. So I'm going to hit play, and then I'm going to plug this into this number, and then I'm going to hit enter at a certain point. Now, this is something that's useful to know. It's not going to kick in the new value until you if it's an enterable, text enterable value, until you hit enter. This is really important to know because you're going to be having to change a whole bunch of things at once, and you need that automation to kick in at a certain time, right? So in my case, for sake of argument, let's say it's at exactly measure 94 that I need the automation to kick in. All right, so I'm going to back it up from before then. This is going to give me plenty of time to get this number ready to go. And then once I hit 94, then I can hit enter, right? So let's give it a whirl. Okay, so I did that first pass. Let me shut off write automation just for a second. You'll see that where I'm at right here is at that minus 18.6 is my original setting. And when I get on the other side of measure 94, you can see it's gone to that minus 15.2. Now it's actually put a whole bunch of nodes in here too, and I probably don't need all of these. I can get rid of them. But what it's really trying to do is it's trying to establish that at this point, it needed to be this minus 18.6. All right, so if I zoom in here, just take a look at what's going on, you can see that these are multiple instances of this threshold setting kind of being set. And this was just from when I was typing into it. I'm not too worried about that right now. So we're just going to move forward, and we're going to do the automation on the other two settings. So next is hold. And again, I have the hold setting that I need in my notepad. So I'm just going to jump back in here. Let me turn on write automation. I'm going to hit play, change the value, hit enter at measure 94. And while we're here, now let's do the release. So there you go. I have my threshold, hold, and release settings as one value back here at measure 92. When I jump forward, they all change. Perfect. I can shut off write automation. And now if I hit play here, we should see the changes take effect once I jump over measure 94. And there you go. Now, obviously, this is actually a little bit easier when there's other music going on, but so that you guys didn't kind of get distracted with everything else, I shut off the rest of the band. But yeah, using the click or other instruments makes it easier to find, to hear the point where you want to trigger that sound. If you do put something in and you find, oh, you know what, this is not exactly the right spot, don't worry. You can always just change the automation further later, right? Or you can go in and you can find whatever the node is that you're having to work with, and you can move it as needed. So now that we've got that in, of course I've only done this on one of the bass drum tracks, but let's just jump forward to difficult section, and let's just take a listen to it here. All right, so it's definitely it's a lot more clicky, and I should say that clicky bass drums is not the type of sounding bass drum that I typically like. But sometimes when you're dealing with stuff in the mix, you have to do little things to try to make it stick out more. And sometimes something like this might mean that you don't have to go crazy with compression, or you don't have to make the EQ sound screwy. Okay, so the other example I wanted to show you was if, say, the drums are doing kind of like a rev up. What do I mean by a rev? Something like this. Right, so it's not that the drums have a big dynamic range because the drummer is playing poorly, right? Or that there is something where you should be correcting this with compression. This is instead something where there is a big dynamic range on purpose, and you need to preserve that, right? So you need to make sure you're not killing it with compression, and you know that's gonna come through the mix, right? That this big dynamic change. Why is this important for automation? Because usually on a rev like this, right, when you're revving up, the initial hits are going to be below the threshold, and so they won't come through. So what you really need to do with your automation is you need to actually completely shut off the plugin effectively, and then turn it on at some point. Now I've actually done the automation here already from before. Let me open up this plugin, and what I effectively do is I already had my setting from that I was using, and in this case it was the threshold that I was messing with. I effectively bypassed the plugin by doing automation on the threshold setting. Keep in mind, I've seen cases before where plugins have an on-off switch, and I've had mixed luck on being able to do automation on those switches. So I recommend, for sake of consistency, if you need to shut off the plugin, if you need to shut off your gate with automation, do it with the threshold setting instead. Now you'll also notice that when I turn on the threshold, right, so I have this kind of big break in the floor tom, right? That's what this one is here. This is tom 4 top side that I've automated here. I also automated the 4th tom bottom side and the snares because I was revving up on all 4 of them. But you'll notice that I shut off the threshold during the big empty section, which is fine. But where do I turn it back on? I'm not turning it back on, afterwards when I'm done, when I have another big empty section, right? I'm turning it on part way through. Now, why is that? Why am I waiting for the gate? I have consistent hits in here, right? I shouldn't even need to use the gate, right? Well, based on how I have my release and hold setting set up, I'm effectively, and I mentioned about this in the other video that I did, I'm using this to sculpt the sound. I want to effectively cause a certain amount of decay between the hits. And if I leave the threshold off completely, then the sound, it's kind of too much reverberation. By using the gate, it kind of cleans up in between the hits a little bit. So that means that the very first thing you have to do is you have to find the point where you're going to want to turn on the threshold, right? So I've shut off the gate just for a second, and I'm going to solo just this tom track. I'm going to crank this up in the mix a little bit. Let's just give this a quick listen. So yeah, there's definitely a whole bunch of parts in here where there isn't a whole lot of attack. And so I don't want to turn on the threshold before it starts to really kind of come through. So I'd say even in here, from based on when I was listening, all of this would definitely be too soon. this all sounds pretty good. Now, you know, it could be a wash anywhere in here, but really you're also going to have to kind of pay attention to where this is playing with your current gate settings, unless you want to, of course, switch your gate to a different setting in here. Okay, so I've duplicated this gate track. The original one has the automation on, and I've completely shut that off. So as you can see, as I'm clicking around, it's not having any effect. So let's take a playthrough now. Now remember, based on how it sounds, we don't want the gate to turn on until at least somewhere in here. But let's actually see how well it's playing with the threshold. Now we want it to clear the threshold pretty well. Now you can see right from this very beginning part, again, it's not even coming through the threshold. So obviously when we do the automation, that's going to be too soon. But as I mentioned before, it also doesn't sound good automated there either. Okay, right here, it's just starting to come through, but it's not quite clearing it. Here, it's clearing a little bit better. By here, I think it's sounding pretty good. Just after 104 is the earliest point that I want to switch the automation back on. So I want to switch the gate back on with the automation. Now, how about what's the latest point though? Yeah, by here, it's starting to sound a little boomy. And this is, let's say, by the third quarter note of 104. So anywhere in between here, these three quarter notes, I think that's probably where I wanted to turn on. So how are we going to do this? Well, there's, like I said before, when you're doing the automation, do each thing in a separate pass. There's two different things we need to do here. We need to automate shutting off the threshold or shutting off the gate, and we need to automate turning it back on. So we're going to do those as two different passes. So first, let's turn it off. Since I got a big gap in here, it's not going to really matter. So I'm just going to make sure I have plenty of space before this kicks in. Turn on the right automation. I'm going to hit play, and then I'm just going to, I know this needs to be minus 60 is the off point for this. And there you go. At this point, it's still at minus 17.2. And here it's at minus 60. Perfect. All right, so now, what's the next thing we need to do? Anywhere between 104 beat 1 and 104 beat 3, we need to go back to minus 17.2. And I need to hit enter. Remember, I can start typing it in ahead of time and have it ready to go. And just use an audible cue if I was having the rest of the band play. Or I could have a click on, right? So in this case, to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to turn on this other track here, which actually has some click and some kind of demo guitar in play. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit play. I'm going to start typing in the numbers, and then, you know, somewhere between here, I'm going to hit enter. All right, so this time I hit enter. It should have been at, I believe it was beat 2, the second quarter note of 104. So let's just check that out. So we're at beat 1 here. Here's about beat 2. That's about when it's switching on by beat 3. There it is, 17.2. So let me shut off the right automation because I don't want to screw that up. And we'll just kind of review, right? Back here, 17.2, minus 60, 17.2, perfect. Now let's hit play and let's confirm that the threshold value changes all on its own. Perfect. So by doing this, I allow the drums to get through during that really quiet passage. And once this starts to get loud again, I can use the gate to again sculpt the sound of the drum. Now, normally what I would do is I would go through and do this same sort of thing on every single track that needs it, right? So in this case, I did it on tom 4 top, but I would also need to do it on tom 4 bottom, snare top, snare bottom, because those are the instruments that I'm playing there. So I hope you guys found that useful. I hope maybe you learned something today. If there's other techniques and whatnot that you guys yourselves find interesting, I'd love to hear about them. Let me know about them in the comments below. I'm putting out other videos like this, other drum recording and equipment reviews and performance videos all the time. So if you don't want to miss out, then don't forget to subscribe. And until next time, peace.